All right. Well, we left off with a little good music and talking about the Chinese being conquered by the Mongols, first under Temujin Genghis Khan, or Chinggis as they like to call him, and later finished by his grandson Kublai. This created what was known as the Yuan dynasty, and there you can see a Yuan princess. This is supposed to represent Kublai being brought Christianity from Europe. That was the time period Marco Polo would visit China. Anyway, the Chinese didn't really like the Mongol rule, mainly because especially the scholar gentry class was subordinated. In fact, they were replaced by maybe Nestorian Christians or Muslims that were brought in to do their jobs. The Mongols didn't really try to adopt too much of the Chinese practices. Mongol women were never going to fit into that patriarchy. They liked riding horses or being in control of the yurt. So there really wasn't a lot of incentive to the Mongols to kind of adopt to Chinese ways, although they did like a lot of the Chinese culture and the good life and the technology and advancements. Eventually, the scholar gentry class stirred up the peasants who would rise up in revolts. Basically, what happened was after Kublai died. First, his beloved wife Chabi, who was a great advisor to him, especially when it came to kind of alleviating some of the harsh practices the Mongols had on the Chinese. And then his beloved son died, and really the Mongols became more corrupt after Kublai died, and the Yuan dynasty was kind of teetering. So anyway, they scholar gentry class, who was never happy with these barbarian Mongols, stirred up the peasants. They rose in rebellion and drove the Mongols north of the border, and a peasant dynasty would arise, or a new dynasty under a peasant. They would be known as the Ming. So the Ming dynasty would follow the Yuan. Now, these pictures are depicting two invasions that the Mongols had of the Chinese in around 1280, leaving first Korea and then later China itself. The Mongols assembled massive armies to invade Japan. But what saved Japan really was typhoons, or as what the Japanese believed were kamis. The few Mongols that did arrive on Japanese shores were defeated by the samurai, who had built a wall to fight behind, and they stopped the Mongol invasions. This is going to become interesting later when we talk World War II and the Japanese kamikaze tactics, kind of hearkening back to the 1280s when they were saved from not one, but two Mongol invasions. I mean, the Mongols were great on horses, on land, not so much on sea. Just depicting Mongol women, as I mentioned. The book, you ought to read it. It's a famous story about the daughter of a Chagatai chief who wasn't going to marry anybody until they could beat her in wrestling. So that's a pretty cool story. So you can see, now, no way were women equal to men, but definitely better to be a Mongol woman than in the Chinese patriarchy at that time. So the Mongols also invaded Russia under another grandson of Genghis Khan. His name was Batu. They started rolling in the middle of winter. Most armies go to winter quarters, and nobody really fights in the winter, except the Mongols. They didn't mind the harsh climate. Besides, it froze up the ground in the rivers, which made it a lot easier to move quickly through Russia. The Russian princes fought kind of piecemeal, and one by one their cities were burned. And the Mongols would force the Russians to pay tribute as part of the Kipchak Khanate. Many people refer to this as the Golden Horde because of all the gold they took from Russia, and Orde kind of means like a group, or in Mongolian, kind of like a cavalry group. So they're known as the Khanate of the Golden Horde. When Mongols ruled Russia, they pretty much left the Russians intact as long as they paid tribute. And this led to a shift in dominance from Kiev to Moscow. Moscow becomes the new Russian center. Why? Well, first of all, it was the center where all the tribute was collected and then passed down to the Kipchak Khanate's capital of Sarai, which was further southeast of Moscow. It was also the home of the Metropolitan. The Metropolitan is the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church, so it had religious meaning. And finally, it would be in the 1480s, really, when the Moscow prince, the Prince of Moscow, Alexei, would lead Russia's freedom from the Mongols. So it would take a while. Many of the Russians believe this rule by the Mongols had set them back, technologically speaking, at least, for several centuries. Excuse me. It's not until Peter the Great in 1700 tries to reorient Russia back towards the west and away from the east, because for so long they'd been dominated by the Mongols. Most of Russia's cities, well, a lot were brick, but a lot were wood. Especially Kiev was known for like 600 wooden churches, and you could see these depictions of the Mongols besieging and destroying these Russian cities. Again, if you resisted the Mongols, you were destroyed. Well, what was good about them? Well, they did promote international commerce. They protected traders. In fact, many people call it the Pax Mongolia because they opened trade routes throughout Europe. It's no coincidence that Marco Polo made it to China, or Ibn Battuta traveled these roads around these times. So the Mongols protected merchants throughout Central Asia along the Silk Road because they wanted the revenue. So it closely tied Africa, Europe, and Asia into one major trading circuit. This was the time the Pope and European rulers dispatched diplomatic missions to the Mongols. They really thought the Christians had this rumor or legend of a Christian king by the name of Prester John that was cut off from his fellow Christians. And they always thought that they would help, Prester John would come back and help them against the Muslims. So especially when Hulagu crushed Baghdad, many Christians were like, oh, these Mongols, they're Prester John, they're going to help us. Unfortunately for the Christians, Batu would roll into Hungary and what today is like Poland and Germany, just devastating those regions. The only thing that really saved Europe from being conquered by the Mongols, well, really two things. One is Europe with its thick forest wasn't good grazing land for the Mongol horses and herds. And secondly, the great Khan who took over after Genghis, his name was Odagai. Odagai died, and Batu had to go back to a Kurultai, a meeting in Karakorum, to kind of secure his position. So he had to stop his conquests. So you did see them try to convert the Mongols to Christianity. Genghis and many of the other Mongol leaders were open to all religions and wanted to hear from all religions, though they would remain shamanistic, believing in the spirits of things like the wind, which whipped hard on the Mongol steppes. So though they were tolerant, they did not convert. The only one that would be the one that conquered the Islamic regions after Hulagu died. It was his son Berke. But anyway, Persian and Chinese courts developed close relations. What happened was the Mongol lands were divided, and what you saw is like the Wan and a couple of the other, what was the Hulagu's portion, the Ilkhanate, would develop close relations and would have a regular exchange of ambassadors. There you can see circuits of trade reaching throughout Mongol regions, and then there's the likely source of the plague. You can see the plague coming in this depiction, in this abbey, carrying arrows to slay the people. It definitely was a difficult time. So One thing the Mongols were good at were taking craftsmen from one area. If you were skilled and you lived in a town, say you were a silversmith or a blacksmith or a weaver, they would take you out of your town and resettle you in another region. In this way, they relocated people. It was one way to control them, but also a way to encourage trade. As I mentioned, they had religious tolerance, and the fact that they supported merchants and religion encouraged many religious people to travel and merchants. Keep in mind, both Ibn Battuta and Marco Polo were merchants. Karakorum was a cosmopolitan center. What that means is it was known for having a lot of different people in it. You would find Muslims and Taoists and Buddhists and Nestorian Christians. And many of the Mongol leaders would hold forth with the scholars of the day and exchange ideas. So, though they're often depicted as kind of a backwards people, just a brutal people, there was much, much more to them than that. No way they would have built the largest continuous empire the world ever saw without having some understanding of technology and trade and the importance of establishing a firm economy. Lastly, the Mongols get blamed for causing the Black Death. There's a story of the siege of Kafka on the Black Sea where the Mongols couldn't break into the city, so they lobbed infected bodies over the walls. Other people believe that the flea that caused the Black Death traversed to Europe in the thick fur of the Mongol ponies. But we do know it came from China or that region in 1331, and within a little more than a decade, it hit Western Europe. A little bit more cut off because they were not part of the Mongol trade routes and conquests. India and sub-Saharan Africa were not nearly as affected by the Black Death as Europe. The Black Death wiped out, in some regions, maybe 50% of Europe. It brought their economy to a standstill. The only really positive benefit of the Black Death in Europe is, with so few people, it made labor far more important, and that would eventually bring about the demise of feudalism, especially in the western part of Europe. But yeah, the Black Death, it definitely was one negative consequence of the world being more connected, as we see today with people traveling all the time. It's easier to get sick in another region or carry a sickness with you when you return. So it's still a consequence. But if you notice, 1331 to 1347, it took a long time for the Black Death really to reach Western Europe. But boy, it did have a tremendous effect. And I do believe that is done. Yeah, I do like the costumes that the Europeans had to wear. You think about it, that was their mask. I wonder, a lot of times they would put herbs like lavender in the nose of the costumes. In fact, a lot of people would wear nosegays in their chest. You know, they'd button them. Maybe that's where bouquets, because the smell was so bad, you could at least, put your head down and smell sweet lavender or other flowers. So the Black Death, yeah, it was definitely a devastating plague. And that's pretty much the chapter. So hope you took some notes.